Hey folks, if you're looking for an in-depth review, you're in the right place. Though, today I'm dabbling into first look territory since Studio MeowNature recently released Depersonalization into early access. A title which seems to pull from the eldritch horror TTRPG Call of Cthulhu. It's a series I've actually had a long-standing fondness for, so seeing a facsimile of it brought to life is extremely interesting to me. That said, the question remains, did this ultimately end up a messy mock-up of the mythos? Or was this surreal story a love letter to the existing lore? I'm your host Arlyeon, let's find out together. For Anon, the life he knew had finally shattered in one eventful evening, marring the memories of his childhood until they became the shadows that plagued his dreams. And it would have stayed a distant trauma were it not for the letter which suddenly showed up at his college dorm many years later, beckoning him to return to his childhood home and uncover the terrible secrets that lurked. Whilst this initial premise is simple enough, it's the execution that really interested me. Parts of the story play out in a straightforward manner, with a number of scenes serving to tell the story. That said, there's plenty of opportunities where you're given the option to choose from or have certain outcomes dictated by your stats and skills, or a combination of the two. Factor in a number of secondary side quests and some snooping around, and there's ample opportunities to dive into the weird lore of the world. That, and to run face first into a small library worth of bad endings, just so you can enjoy dying in new and interesting ways. Honestly, I sort of wish the game kept track of all the different ways I'd shuffled off the mortal coil. There had been a few. Anyways, it's interesting, even if at the end of the day it's a rather short experience. But here's the thing. That initial scenario is just the tip of the iceberg, serving as both a tutorial and to properly introduce the premise of the game and the reason for its name. See, once you gain access to the hub, you're essentially tasked with creating vessels that you'll be observing, who all have their own quirks and affinities based on what you establish, which is extremely important given that while the initial scenario was relatively linear insofar as the outcome, with most of the side routes serving to provide a bit of extra lore, some mechanical benefits, resources, or a new and interesting way to shuffle yourself off the mortal coil, the other modules are a different beast entirely, because the people you talk to, the areas you snoop through, and the fights you pick or avoid, all these choices and others beside cause the scenarios to diverge in rather dramatic ways, in fact. And just like its source material, it's very possible to screw the pooch. My initial run-through of the second module, the first real scenario where I had choices, led to basically everyone dying. So I made a new character and went at it from a different angle, and I suddenly found myself venturing into areas I never saw the first time around, fighting a number of mythological creatures and culminating in a fairly good outcome despite everything. And that wasn't even the whole of it either, because I went back again and got a slight permutation of the first ending that now saw me infested by an alien taint. And then I discovered a different route entirely that relied on me hearing out a character and then murdering her anyways. And while I decided to resolve that by punching out an eldritch abomination, I should note there was an option to side with that abomination, and there was another option besides that as well. Options I feel rather keen to explore at a future date. And this freedom of choice also extends to the other two scenarios that are currently accessible as well. Like I said, while it's the second module that I've done the most exploring in, the third one provides a lot of avenues for you to pore over, which left me excited for the fact that the developer has implied there's going to be at least 3 story-focused modules being added in later updates. Really, my biggest gripe that I have to make is that the overall translation does feel a bit stiff. That and the fact that the side stories you can engage with after completing the quest are, well, they're currently bugged. While they're interesting, these visual novel-esque side segments don't seem to properly read your stats and skills, which means you'll always fail every choice in them at the current juncture, which is a shame because I sort of wish I knew what would happen if you successfully completed one. But, already have a fair amount to obsess over. For one thing, while you have a pre-made character that you get to babysit for your first module, from that point onwards, you need to rely on the characters you generate, something which very quickly led me to making whatever dumb concept I'd like. I say this because character creation is sort of complex. It's not so much the actual distribution of points, that's the same for everyone, given you choose an archetype, it gives you certain base skills and items, and then you can just play around with whatever skill points and flesh out the rest from there. No, what makes it complicated, beyond the fact that you can utterly screw yourself over by hyper-focusing on things, is the traits that you're obliged to take, as there's so many potential negatives to juggle. For instance, I made a character who had horrendous starting sanity. So I gave them a trait that locked their sanity at a slightly lower position, but prevented them from ever gaining any or from actually losing any. Another character I made, a serial killer, with absolutely no diplomacy, so they were basically obliged to brute force their way through every solution in their path because they couldn't actually succeed at a single diplomacy check. Mind you, they did this with aplomb since they basically breathed violence, especially given a certain starting mythos item I gave them. That said, it's not just the weirdness of the quirks you need to be mindful of, since you have to give your character a defining personality trait, like vanity or caution, which can bar certain story options from being chosen. You also get to choose your character's life philosophy, which also factors into this, as you'll slowly regain sanity points for choosing ones that fall in line with yours. Which gets sort of funny if your lifestyle philosophy would benefit you, but then your defining personality trait prevents you from taking it. I mean, you can technically still pick that option, but you're not actually going to get sanity back from it because you're going to have to spend sanity to choose it in the first place. Anyways, once you've gotten your character, you're basically good to go. That is, unless you manage to find a mythical item in the prologue or one of the other modules. These are actually pretty notable, since they're extremely powerful objects that give you a decisive edge in clearing out the content when you find them in a module, and their mythical status allows them to be pulled out from the stories they belong to, at which point you can bring them with you into future modules or even a module you've already cleared. Hats off, by the way, to the one that I use with my idiot serial killer, because while it makes him even dumber than he already was, it made him so fucking strong he couldn't actually fail any strength or constitution check he came across. That said, once you're done fiddling, you're basically good to go, and the actual process of making your way through the modules is surprisingly open-ended. You can interact with all the NPCs in a number of ways, whether it's chatting, pickpocketing them, bribing them, throwing hands, consoling them, even trying to win battles of rhetoric with them. There's also spell options, though I only actually found one that worked on them, and that was by hexing any check they had, which was delightful whenever I had to go and do a competitive check against them, because those are extremely arbitrary to win. In any case, a lot of your time playing will be spent doing some mild investigatory adventure gaming, albeit with the caveat of RNG dictating how well those actions go. Which, okay, it can get a bit frustrating sometimes. See, all your stats and skill checks are percentile, but there's just times where I'm rolling straight 90s, 10 or 15 dice in a row, which can often force you down certain narrative paths or into outright dead ends. Because, yes, you do have a luck pool that allows you to re-roll dice, but not only does it do nothing to stop you from rolling worse anyways, it refills very slowly, mostly by finding certain narrative clues, which is painful when you factor in that there's also checks which hinge on luck. Admittedly, you do get the option to occasionally try and gain stats if you find a book or bribe the right NPC, but even that is a bit random, as it requires you to roll a check that gets harder the more stats you have, and which gives you absolutely nothing if you fail. Well, I say nothing, but that's not quite true. Mostly because if you finish a scenario, you get chunks of time to spend on developing your character, which you can entirely use to get more of your base stats, but you can also use it to get skills. Except, if you fail, you're liable to get permanent negative traits on anyone that requires a roll. And you're stuck with them. Really, your only avenue at that juncture is seeing if you can tweak them into something less painful with the turning option, which flips them over to their alternate form. This costs meta currency though, and it also takes your precious limited time to do. Since the only way to get time is to finish a module, but once you finish a module you can't go back to it on that character, this means you have a very limited amount of training you can do and ways to fix bad traits you get. In fact, I think the large bulk of negative traits I got are from training. Yeah. In fact, despite how friggin' painful the combat and survival elements of the game were, I ultimately found them a bit more forgiving. Mostly. At least once I started to engage with the crafting menu more and remembering to make armor, because geez, do you have a tiny amount of health and enemies will ruthlessly wreck your face, which has dire consequences since injuries will rack up, absolutely ravage your skill checks, and set you up for even more injuries. Or just kill you outright. You're incredibly fragile, especially if you don't spec into combat in favor of, interacting with the world and its mysteries, and healing isn't exactly readily accessible. And if you get the Scarred trait, it is actually the worst trait in the game, since it will perpetually drain your health non-stop over the course of the entire module as you move around. It is a nightmare to manage in its base form, and while it transforms into something good, holy crap, if you get Scarred, tweak that into its better form as soon as you can. Anyways, the big thing here I wanted to actually say though is I was legitimately startled by how hard some of the fights in the modules were. I know I mentioned that it is ultimately a bit more forgiving than I expected, but some of these things are still so tricky that I wasn't quite sure how I was supposed to beat them. There's fights in there that are meant as puzzles, and some of them are just brutal beatdowns meant to test your limits or dissuade you from a route on your initial run-through. That's not to say you can't beat them. In fact, I earned myself a distinct ending and a mythos item that led to a scene in the hub that would have introduced a team element if it was currently implemented, because I managed to clear one of these obscenely hard encounters. Sadly, early access means I didn't actually get to engage with this, so I don't get to find out if it would have in fact let me bring in more diverse teams of characters I created, since that definitely would have made some of the harder routes a bit more viable and just overall benefit exploration. I mean, it's ironic that it came from clearing the hardest piece of content I could have done, but yeah, still, I've gone through these modules a good handful of times, and here's the thing, I'm still interested in discovering what other permutations, endings, traits, and little kernels of story I still might be able to retrieve from them. Honestly, it was pretty magical to learn that I could actually have new characters inherit the unique traits I'd found in the course of my journey. That said, I do have to mention, while there are certainly some challenging combat situations to butt your head against, if you're looking for a combat-focused adventure to bash your head against, the rogue mode isn't actually implemented yet. As far as options go, it would be accessible readily enough once you've cleared one of the early module endings, but yeah, no dice on actually being able to do that either, which means I don't know if it would have provided much insofar as character building either. And speaking of characters, while you only have 4 models to choose from as you make your otherworldly investigation agency, a number that feels slightly limiting given the sheer permutations possible in a stage to go and explore the story. Honestly, I think the main reason I didn't make more characters is because I actually found it slightly jarring just to have those 4 populating my list of current characters. The duplication just sort of pained me and coaxed me to literally retire some of them. And it's also just a shame because they look pretty darn good. My only lament is we don't have a sufficiently gritty trench-coated character so I can properly play the hard-boiled noir detective who's doomed at the end of his journey. Still, there's a certain stylishness to the whole thing, and a fair bit of love put into the world at large. It was nice that as I was exploring through places, it had details like torches or food disappearing when I picked them up. And I'll admit, I grabbed everything, since there was a helpful UI feature that highlighted all the interactable items and NPCs in a room. Really, the only slightly jarring element is the fact that while the overall monster design is pretty good, there's a bit of an anime flavor to a couple of the enemies. In the sense that a few of the murderous monsters you face off against are essentially eldritch waifus from beyond time and space. Not that this stopped them from brutally murdering me in the ensuing slightly flashy battles, but it is a slight tone shift. Then again, the OST does a decent job of making it work. There's some great battle music to listen to for when things get down to bullets and brass knuckles, but it also finds plenty of opportunities to provide subtly suspenseful or otherworldly tracks that generally complement the scenes quite well. Really, the most tricky element for me is just the voicing. Specifically, all the prose segments and character dialogue has an AI reading option, and it's just a bit weird.
It was a great shop for Mistress Carter. It's a shame to think of. I didn't know much about the day she disappeared, so I took the lip.
What have you put in place?
A diary fell on the floor. I recognized it as Miss Diary. Madame had always treasured that diary, but I was confused by
Snow. I'm going to take care of Snow. My bad.
I leave it on because developers intended it as the suggested way to play, but there's definitely moments it's jarring, such as cadence or the way it emphasizes the slightly stuffy segments of the script. It's an odd artistic decision to say the least, though if you do hate it, I should note that you can disable it. Anyways, that brings me to the end of this, and well, the game is far from over at this juncture. There's still key elements missing like the rogue/battle mode, the team system, and at least another 3 modules. And yet, despite that, I've sunk so much time into this game already, trying to see all the different permutations of those scenarios, seeing all the different twists and turns that could emerge as I made different choices, to the point that they culminated in entirely different narrative directions, puzzles, boss fights, and of course the endings. Even variations of those same endings. While the second scenario stands out to me still for just having the most different outcomes, I legitimately love the process of poring over the third and fourth, discovering the new mythos items and traits that could help define my character, and for the hints of things that were going to be coming. Also, I really did love discovering all of the traits, not only for the fact that I had them on the characters I was running through the modules, but for the fact that I was acquiring them and then able to pass them on to investigators in future and make very interesting, very different setups for characters. Also, just the fact that if you really didn't want to go and interact with the scenario, you actually had the ability to inherit traits and abilities from that scenario to modify a character without going through the entire process again. You can only do that with one scenario, but I think it's a really interesting feature. All in all, it's actually just really great stuff, and discovering all of it has me honestly looking forward to the game's full release and all the small developments that will occur along the way. Especially given that they've been rather diligent about patching issues even as I was making this review. So yeah, that's my 2 cents, which means thanks for tuning in. If you agree, disagree, or just have something to say to me, feel free to comment. And if you enjoy my efforts to create new indie reviews, interviews, and gaming content, hit the subscribe button and the bell. For the Discord savvy folks, there's a link to my community, the Crit Hit Cauldron, in the video description, and to my Patreon so you can support me and the other members of Crit Hit. Also to my Twitch, if you want to see me get dunked on in indie games live. That said, I'll catch you on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.